Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Bishop Peter Stuart. Now, Bishop Peter is Bishop in Newcastle in Australia. And so, Bishop, it's wonderful to get you on the Godcast. How are you?
I'm really well. It's been a warm day here. I can tell it's been a cold day there, or beginning to be a cold day, but so lovely to be with you and your listeners.
Yeah, just Peter, just to give people a little bit of context to your working setting, give us a kind of a sense of how big the diocese is and whereabouts actually you are.
So we're on the east coast of New South Wales. We're about 2.5 hours north of Sydney, which is the capital of New South Wales. We were established as a diocese in 1847, so before the English Diocese of Newcastle was established. We're actually quite a small diocese. We've got about 50 parishes, four schools, and we've got two welfare agencies which are part of our work. It's about 5 hours drive from north to south, and about 3 hours drive from east to west.
In the context of the diocese, Peter, is it rural? Is it urban? Is it a bit of both? What are some of the key issues that are affecting your life and ministry there as a bishop?
Yeah, so the Diocese of Newcastle was established shortly after the area of Newcastle was established, and it was called Newcastle because they found coal here, and it was established as a convict colony. And coal is still a really big part of what goes on here. We're the largest coal mining port in the Southern Hemisphere and perhaps in the world. So we've got shipping to and fro all the time, exporting coal and lots of coal mines in the west. The city of Newcastle, adjacent to the city of Lake Macquarie, got about 500,000 people in it. And across the whole area, we've got about 1 million people in it. In terms of church life and all the rest, Australia is a very secular country and getting progressively more secular. So some of our suburbs have over 50% of people who declare themselves to be no religion. And so we're in a sort of an environment where I think we're in a religious marketplace, including a marketplace for people who have no interest in religion. And so that changes how we operate, I think, in terms of trying to proclaim the good news of Jesus. And we're not an established church. So all churches have equal standing in Australia, have done since the late 19th century. And so the Roman Catholic Church is actually the largest denomination here. And then we've got all sorts of Christian descriptions working together sometimes, working differently at other times.
So you mentioned there about the secularization of the country, Peter. Does that kind of reflect in similar situations to the UK, where some of our churches are struggling to maintain numbers or even struggling to exist?
Oh, that's a very big issue for us here. Um, so a couple of factors play into that. Um, Much of the area was established when it was a rural economy and a small mining economy. And so we've got church buildings in area where population didn't grow. Then we've got church buildings which were built after the Second World War when there was a bit of a boom in church going, which then has halted. And so we're trying to work out what it will look like in the next 20 to 50 years. And I talk with people about trying to create a sort of a footprint or a skeleton or a spine of vibrant congregations, which we will resource in a variety of ways. But it has meant that we've needed to let some church buildings go, and there's always a grief in relation to that. I've been following your Save the Parish movement there, and there are some similar themes. Like in one way, parishes are the lifeblood of denominations because that's where people gather to worship God on a regular basis. There's an attraction to being in those local communities. But here, every one of our congregations is self-funded. It's no central funding of a congregational life and ministry. So, in a sense, there is a user pays piece to it. So, we have people doing a great deal of work around fundraising and generosity and support for the work that we do. So I think the picture's a little different, but it's it's not easy to be in ministry at the moment. We're facing a community that is less interested in the church in terms of paying for it or attending to it. Although I understand from sociologists, they do like a church when they're trying to build new suburbs.
Yeah, yeah. And Peter, a little bit about yourself. I mean, people wouldn't know by your wonderful Australian accent, but your origins are in the UK. That's right, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, I've got no Northumberland accent in me at all now, I don't think. Yeah, so I was born in Alnwick in the early 1960s. And then we went and lived down in the Cotswolds. And then we emigrated to Australia in the early 1970s. There were various schemes called £10 POMs, which was that the effectively you paid very little, and the Australian government or the New South Wales government drew people out to Australia for various forms of work. And my father was a teacher and came out and joined the teaching service in New South Wales. Um, I've been back to England a few times for the Lambeth Conference, and I was there earlier this year. And I had the amazing privilege of being invited back into the house I was born in, and then going down the road to the church I was baptized in, which is now a Roman Catholic church, and just being able to revisit something of that story. And the nice, cute thing about that is that's in the Diocese of Newcastle. So there's Alnwick is in the Diocese of Newcastle there, and I'm from the Diocese of Newcastle here.
It's really funny, isn't it, how things turn out sometimes? And what about do you ever? I didn't travel as far as you. I was born in London, and I sometimes wonder how life might have been different had I stayed there. Do you have a moment to reflect what life might have been like if you'd have stayed here?
I think that's a really, really great question. I think my parents would have been Brexiters because one of the reasons why they left the United Kingdom was the emergence of the European Economic Community. So I think they had concerns in terms of what England might have been looking like. And then my older brother wanted to join the army. And so at the time, they were still sending forces to Northern Ireland. So I think life would have been quite different for us if we'd remained. The and I don't think my parents ever fully settled into the Australian way of life, and I would describe that my upbringing was in an English home in an Australian house. So for a long time, we had the roast dinners on a Sunday and things like that, and tried to weave our story into the story of our heritage. At the same time, it was very hot outside.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. My wife came the other way. My in-laws went out to Australia, probably in the same circumstances as your parents. And my wife was born in Australia and then came back to the UK. So it's
Oh, right. Yeah.
but it's never been back since. So, but maybe one day we'll head out there.
Yeah. Interestingly, my parents never returned, and for a long time, I was the only member of my family who had gone back to have a look. And um, there's a piece of Australian Aboriginal story that talks about country or nation, and they have a very strong sense that country speaks to them, that the stories of their forebears are in all that remains. And I took something of that with me when I arrived back in January this year. It was too cold to take my shoes and socks off and walk on the ground. But there was a sense of just pausing for a little bit when I went down to Almouth to have a sense of that country which had formed me, speaking to me, and to recognize that it was part of who I am and I'm part of it, and to allow that to just be in me for a little while. And that's a really big part for Australian Aboriginal people. We do something before major meetings, whether it be public service meetings, community meetings, or church gatherings, where Aboriginal people will either do a welcome to country if they're from that area or an acknowledgement of country. And it's a way of saying country and place is really important to us. And um, that was a really rich thing to do for me, even more so this time. And then going into the house, of course,
Mm.
that I was born in, the church that I was baptized in, about a week after I was born, it was that sense of, well, this is part of my story. Allow it to echo in my soul. And
Yeah.
that was a beautiful experience and a sense of synergy between the Australian Aboriginal spirituality and my own story. And there is a touch of the Celtic in that as well, the thin spaces, and just to allow that. And I was traveling with my son, and he was watching on, seeing his dad do some interesting things and making sense of who he was.
Yeah, that's lovely. Really nice. Thank you for sharing that, Peter. Now let's get down to some church politics. People, I can hear people certainly in the UK going, ask him some proper questions now. Um,
There we go
you
for
know,
it.
and as a member of
I'm
the
up for it.
and as a member of the General Synod, we are very much been in the eye of the storm here in the UK with the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Um, I wonder what you make of it all, Peter, from afar, looking on at what's unfolded in recent weeks.
Yeah. To give a little bit of context for you, in 2012, the Australian government announced what we call a Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And that Royal Commission ran for 5 years, I think similar to your ICSCA inquiry. So um, a number of case studies, lots of opportunity for survivors to speak of their story, and then recommendations around public policy. My diocese was subject to the longest case study in the Royal Commission. Um, we had a 30-year history whereby perpetrators of abuse had proliferated, and when survivors came forward, they didn't receive the support that they needed. So we've spent a long time coming to terms with that story. We began that in around 2004. The whole of the Australian Church began to recognise that we needed to respond quite differently to disclosures of child sexual abuse. And with the Royal Commission, even further recommendations. So our public stance in relation to survivors is simply quite different to what we've read of the Church of England. I shared with a senior leader in child protection in our diocese the Macon report, and I shared the Archbishop of Canterbury's recent speech. And this child protection lead just was aghast, just felt that survivors would experience great trauma hearing the way things were being spoken about, how their lives were being spoken about, and not hearing an echo of their experience being given credibility and given priority. And so that shapes our context here in Australia. And it's not just for us in the Diocese of Newcastle, it's across all churches. And so my diocese, through our synod, has offered deep and consistent apologies for the experience that people had. You asked earlier about closure of churches. We've actually deliberately been closing and selling some churches to fund redress so that we're actually able to make prompt and pastoral settlement to survivors of abuse. And that continues for us. We've imagined many years ahead of that. But the critical thing we did was we actually saw this as mission. We understood that Christ would want us to do this. Christ would want us to reach out to the survivor of abuse and extend compassion and care. And we also saw it as mission to the community around, that we would never have credibility to speak any of the Christian story if we weren't acting and behaving in certain ways. Um, And we're only as good as our last interaction. And so I'm very careful of not overstating our position. I could wrong foot tomorrow and a survivor actually say, Bishop Peter, you've actually not heard me properly. So very careful to walk with huge humility in this area, but preferencing the survivor of abuse in the way that we think Jesus would. So I look at all that's gone on in the Church of England. I've had the privilege of having some one-on-one conversations with Archbishop Justin. I can't make sense of that conversation and what I've seen, but his public words, especially those recently in the House of Lords, were um, ill-timed, ungracious, uncaring, and it echoes here in Australia. You know, some of our survivors of abuse look and wonder how we will respond. I'm sorry, that's a long answer, but it's a very significant piece of work for us here. Great harm's been caused, and the church can only move to positions of humility and try and, in some ways, honor the survivor by our actions.
Thank you, Peter, and a very well considered response. There's a couple of further points. What do you think is deterring an institution such as the Church of England from independent safeguarding? To me, as a regular priest working in Burnley who's had a long career in management, it seems to me that it seems the sensible and the obvious thing to do. What do you think is preventing the church from moving in that direction?
Yeah, so our safeguarding is internal and arm's length, and fiercely so. Our Director of Professional Standards is not a person of faith. She openly declares that, but is committed to child protection and is committed to a strong and robust response in relation to that. I think the difference here is that the public policy position is different. So mandatory reporting by all sorts of officials, including clergy, has been in place for a number of years and has been strengthened. And so the government takes an active interest in child welfare, and they will then actually undertake investigations. They will actually require reporting. And so the government is fiercely engaging for the protection of the child, which then gives a different approach to what the churches might do internally because there's a level of accountability. And there's different regimes in the different states in Australia, but they're all driven by the same approach, which is that the government is committed to the protection of children and expects people who have concerns about the safety of children in the course of their work to make mandatory reports. And it's also a crime in New South Wales not to report child abuse, and people risk prosecution if they don't do that. And I think that those public policy instruments actually help all of our institutions. I understand that you've had issues, say, for example, in sporting clubs. And so we've also had issues in sporting and other community associations. So the government position is not just one in relation to religion, but with every group to make sure that there's a protective environment.
Bishop Peter, it's so refreshing to hear you speak so honestly and openly. One of the things that I've been critical of, and other Christians in the UK have been critical of, is the silence of the bishops, and the kind of the one lone voice has been Bishop Helen Ann Hartley, who ironically is the Bishop of Newcastle in the UK,
Mm.
and who was also down in New Zealand for a period of time. What's your take on that? And do you think uh, bishops should speak out when these matters come to the public attention?
Certainly, when there are issues within a diocese, I think that the bishop needs to be able to speak in their diocese as a person who is committed to safeguarding, and that the public will only have confidence if there's an understanding that the culture of safeguarding is at every level within an organisation. That's the public policy position, but it's also the position that the diocese in Australia adopt. Um, yeah, I think Bishop Helen Ann has been a powerful spokesperson. And I do wonder if something of her New Zealand experience has helped her understand that that the broader community is listening with different ears to what the churches are doing, and simply just expect people to be accountable for their mistakes as well as also celebrating their successes. Um, I don't know enough about the English situation and what holds it in particular places, but we would simply lose our credibility in the public space if we weren't actively addressing these matters.
And through your own experience and what you've witnessed in the last few weeks, how damaging is this to the to the overarching church, Peter? I mean, we've been number one in the news headlines for a number of weeks because of this story, which is lamentable for me, because I think I represent and like to feel others feel I might represent hardworking, genuine, grafting Christians, of which there are many who are actually a bit tired of this and want a line drawn in the sand and processes put in place to ensure people's safety. What's your thoughts?
There's a variety of thoughts. So the first one is that I think the credibility of a local priest and the local community will often have great strength. So I would want to encourage you and your peers to have that sense that the work that you're doing is seen by people around you and recognized for who you are. And if you show a commitment to safeguarding and well-being and support for people, that will be known in communities. But it's hard won and easily lost. So that's one part of it. The second part is, I think any illusion that there's going to be a line drawn in the sand and that will be it, I'm afraid, won't work. Um, so we had been well underway with beginning to address our history in about 2009, 2010. 14, 15 years later, we are still working through those issues. Um, And when leaders lose their credibility, it does take a long time for people to put their faith and trust back in them. And we see it as generational work here, and call everyone to that generational work. And I don't mean to create despondency for people in that. My sense is, which is why we aligned it with mission. Where would Christ stand? Where would Christ be looking? What would Christ be expecting of us? And when we act in that way, um, the rich, compassionate love and grace which is shown um, influences communities of faith, that they actually see things differently. But I want to stress again, the purpose of doing that is not for our gain. It's actually for the right response, justice, mercy, and care for those who have been harmed.
Thanks again. I'm just looking at the time, and this is whizzing by, but I've got so many questions I want to cram in. If we could move on, Peter, to another controversial subject, and it'd be interesting to learn how things are in Australia and how that bounces back to the UK. So, another issue that we've been wrestling with in this General Synod has been the one of same-sex relationships, living in love and faith that seems to have been rumbling on forever. We are not quite at the point of offering prayers of blessing, although that's been agreed in the Synod. It's about finding a way forward. What's the situation in Australia, Peter, and what wisdom can you impart on this tricky situation?
Wow. I was imagining that this question would come. It's very divisive here in Australia. So, the Diocese of Sydney is a strong sponsor of GAFCON and resources and encourages GAFCON. So that's the next door neighbour to my south. That's a diocese which doesn't affirm the ordination of women as priests and bishops. It's a diocese which affirms complementarianism and takes a strict view on human sexuality. That position, through the way our General Synod is established, is really a strong position in our General Synod. So I don't think that there will ever be any official liturgies of blessing of same-sex marriage in the Australian Church forming part of our prayer books or the like. By a quirk of our church law, it is possible for ministers in certain contexts to approve a blessing ceremony of the two people that are in a same-sex relationship. That's a contested debate, but it's we have an internal church court called the Appellate Tribunal that has ruled that can occur. Um, Basically, there's a watching game that's going on, and if that becomes a dominant practice in any diocese, we're going to see that tested. And certainly, we have nothing like civil partnerships. And clergy who are same gender attracted, who may want to share a house with a lifelong companion, are very wary of the situation here in Australia, more wary than they would be in the Church of England. My own diocese, with a number of others, firstly has apologised to LGBT people. Um, we attempted to pass laws that would make it possible for clergy in same-gender relationships not to be subject to discipline. That was found that it couldn't work in the way that we did it. We are very supportive of inclusion. I'm very public in various debates around that. So supported moves in the New South Wales Parliament, which was successful around the banning of conversion practices. Jane Ozanne had been a great help to me in helping me understand some of those things. And then just recently we passed an equality bill that makes the situation, particularly for transgender people, at law in New South Wales more equal. And again, I was a public spokesperson for that. Um, but I can go to parishes or go to one in a few weeks' time where the people will go, "Oh, Bishop, we do really think you're wrong." And then the week before, I think I'm going to one where they go, "We do, Bishop, we do think that you're right." Um, um, and there are moves in Australia by some who, if there is a formalisation of um, same-sex blessings or same-sex liturgies within the Church of England, they will test to see whether that breaches what we call our fundamental declarations and creates a reason to separate us from communion with the Church of England. It's as serious and as controversial as that. I, uh, we here in the diocese try very hard to hold together with diverse views and try to model that in some ways. And our clergy committed themselves 2 years ago to speaking well of those who have difference, and to be very careful about how they use the Bible and not to use it as a weapon to bludgeon one another, but to use it as the holy text that it is meant to be for us all. Um, to finalize my answer in that space, to give a sense of it, a movement of people set up another diocese called the Diocese of the Southern Cross. And a former Archbishop of Sydney is the bishop providing support to that Diocese of the Southern Cross, which has congregations in a number of dioceses in that breakaway sort of sense. So watching carefully, trying to walk in fellowship, but the tension is deep and real.
In many ways, it's reassuring to know that we're not alone in that space, Peter. But it is difficult. I've just got a couple more questions. One, I'm
Oh, I've
proudly.
got all the time in the world. You'll edit this later.
Yeah, but it's so good what you've said. I don't want to edit it because there's so much rich information in there. But something I'm very passionate about, Peter, is that I'm proudly a working class priest in Burnley, and
Mm.
I've raised the private members motion, which is going to be debated in February about a national strategy for vocations for people from the working classes. I see this as a rich harvest of
Mm.
opportunity. I was just wondering if that comes up in discussion in Australia.
Um, What we've done, so the Australian theological education scene has changed quite a lot. There's actually only one theological college which is primarily residential. The rest are a bit more like St. Mellitus, where we've got strong academic teaching, but people that are connecting in different ways. In our own diocese, we've got ordained local clergy. We've got, which means clergy who've been prepared to primarily work in that particular ministry. We've got a range of non-stipendiary or self-supporting ministers, and then a range of clergy who are for full-time stipendiary ministry. And we've adapted the theological education and formation requirements to recognize that if someone comes in partway through um, a transition in vocation partway through life, that the idea of being able to go away for a 3 year seminary style education when they're supporting a family paying a mortgage just simply doesn't work. And I think that's allowed us to bridge to people who've come from all sorts of different backgrounds. Um, and uh, I think we've got to hear the gospel in a variety of dialects. We hear from cross-cultural ministry what it's like to hear when people of Asia tell us, rather than the bread of life, Jesus is the rice of life, to try and actually help us understand that. Or if you go to the Middle East and hear some people speaking, out of a particular context there, well, it's true, I think, that we've actually got to hear the dialects on which we've been born and brought up in so that we can minister to people in those dialects and across those dialects. And we actually understand about mission that it's never like it was in the old days where we actually take the gospel to people. We actually encounter the living Christ in a variety of contexts. And mission is bilateral or multilateral. So, there's no doubt that a working class priest who's discovered life and faith in one context has something to say to middle class, upper class clergy and congregations, and vice versa. And how do we hear the richness of all of that? So I think a variety of vocational paths has been really, really important. Our biggest work area, and our director of formation and mission works on this, is actually making sure that the clergy who go out into parishes at the time of their ordination are profoundly people of prayer and reflection. And that's been one of the most important things. Tricks and tools have a shelf life, but knowing that you have a deep relationship with Jesus is the profound and ongoing thing. So that's the sort of work that we're doing here. So I look forward to hearing how that's going to be. And I love seeing some of the stories on Twitter and on Facebook of people whose different backgrounds in England are coming to the forefront.
Yeah.
I think it's exciting, and we've got a lot to learn from you.
Yeah, that's great. And I love what you said about prayer. There are lots in between, isn't there? But we've in our own church, we've really trying to re-engage our community in prayer outside of the church walls, on a regular into a rhythm, because we believe in the value of it. And
Yeah.
it's probably a nice way to bring the conversation to a close, Peter, with in this time of Advent as we record this, with Christmas on the horizon, with so much trauma around the world. I think people will perhaps maybe like to finish on a positive note. We've talked about some of the challenges and difficulties in church in Australia and in the UK, but ultimately Christians have to remain hopeful, don't they?
Oh, they do. And, we're approaching the celebration of Emmanuel, the Prince of Peace. And the peace we'd like to see doesn't seem to come quickly, but that overarching, everlasting peace that we're promised by Jesus, when we catch a glimpse or a glimmer of it, it's profoundly changing for us. And, I see in the face of young and old Christians, male and female Christians, clergy and lay, that positive glimpse of the Lord and Savior who has changed them. And when they're at their best, that sense of confidence and hope that they have in their relationship with Jesus does echo forth in a form of peace, and that's transformative. I yearn with everyone that wars may end, that the violence may cease, and all of that. And I don't quite understand why the now and the not yet is part of who we are. But glimpsing peace and seeing peace is something that I always rejoice and relish in. And it's a gift. And it's a gift that Jesus gives to us and we give to others. And I'm taking that into my Christmas celebrations this year, just going, you are the Prince of Peace. You've offered us life and hope, and you renew it in us as we break bread and share wine together, as the scriptures are opened, as we light candles and we pray. And I pray for you, Alex, and for your church community, for your diocese, for the Church of England, that that might be so. And I know that there are many of our friends in England who are praying for us here in the Diocese of Newcastle, and I'm really grateful for that.
What a lovely, lovely way to end our conversation, Peter. Thanks so much for your time, and likewise, we will certainly be praying for you and the work and the ministry of the people that are under your care, and we wish you a peaceful end to Advent and a joyful Christmas when it comes.
God bless you, Alex, and thank you for the invitation. It's been a delight to talk with you. And maybe one day when I'm back over there, we can meet in person. And last time I was there, I had a Guinness no alcohol because I'm not a drinker anymore. And but I had one of those, and I went, that is pretty darn close, and I really enjoyed that. So maybe we could have that together.
Well, yeah, I'd love to get you to Burnley, where the traditional drink is a Benedictine and hot. And I'm going to leave it there and ask people to go and Google that because it's quite extraordinary how Benedictine is consumed more in Burnley than anywhere else in the world. Thanks, Peter. Thanks so much.
God bless.